Hello everyone and welcome to episode 35 of the Daily Critique, where today I'm going to be discussing 5 images by Andrew Robertson. They're pretty epic mountain images, it has to be said, taken from various places around the world. There's certainly a lot to love about these images, but there's a few editing bits and pieces that I would do differently, so we're going to do another editing video today. So let's get started. These are the rather spectacular images that Andrew sent in. I do have a bit of critique to offer, mostly on the editing side, but what amazing images these are from some pretty special places. So we'll go through them one by one in Photoshop, and we're going to start with a couple from Baffin Island. I think these were taken with Artur Stanis. I don't know if that's exactly how his name is said, but I know that he's a photographer who's done a few trips to Baffin Island, and I think he ran this trip a few years ago because I recognised the conditions. Funnily enough, I'd actually at the time been planning to do a trip of my own to Baffin Island. That ultimately fell through for a whole host of reasons, but I've got the maps and I've pored over them, and maybe that will now be a trip that I won't do because I'm a little bit concerned about the environmental side of things. But it's a pretty incredible place, and this peak Mount Thor just here has the biggest vertical drop in the world, or in fact I think it's just past vertical. So yeah, pretty sensational valley. This is the Weasel River here. So as for this shot, I think compositionally it's beautiful. I mean, it follows some fairly classic ideas. I guess there's a really good sense of balance between the mountains on either side here. This lovely framing effect that we've seen in quite a few images now, and I still haven't managed to draw very well, but then it just makes more of this focal point here. I mean, quite clearly that peak is the star of the show, and yet the ones either side aren't too bad either. Pretty wild mountain landscapes there, and then you've got the leading line of the river coming into the valley just to add to that. Now the lighting is nothing special, and that's unfortunately the nature with many of these northern regions, and you really just have to make the most of the light which you're presented with, because of course you can't just spend forever at these locations waiting on the light. You're in true wilderness, and you have a schedule to stick to and a lot of backpacking to do as well, which of course makes everything harder. So often you're taking these photographs when you're tired, so I can appreciate all of the effort that has gone into making an image like this. I would say that the edit could have been handled a little differently. I mean, we've got the blue sky here has been turned into this sort of grey navy colour, which I don't particularly like. I know there's certain photographers who do that kind of colour grading almost to their images, but it's not to my personal taste. And I think this yellow highlight has just got a little bit hot and saturated, especially by comparison to the desaturation of the other areas of the image. So I'll just have a quick edit here. Let's reset this because I think this is my edit. Darken the highlights, lift the shadows, add some contrast, warm the white balance a little bit further. Actually, the numbers here look a bit crazy to me, so maybe that's something specific about the camera being used. And we can see that the sky here is kind of cyan-y, so I'm going to add some magenta as well, and it starts to look quite nice. And then if I try and recover some of these highlights, I'm just locally darkening that exposure there, and let's increase that those sliders to their full effect. And I think we're kind of getting there with this edit now. Let's add a bit more contrast and colour to that foreground, because I've just seen how richly colourful some of these little petals are, and maybe that didn't come out in that previous edit as well. So that's something that I want to enhance. So let's even add a bit of saturation and warmth there. And then finally, aside from doing the dust spots, which I'm not going to bother with, let's just darken the top of the sky there. just to hold the eye in. And actually, let's lose a little bit of the top of the frame, not quite as much as was done in the previous edit. So if I compare those two, yeah, I think I prefer this warmer, more saturated. I mean, of course, I would say that is my edit, but anyway, you can hopefully see the thought process there. So let's go back into Photoshop and look at this second image. Again, of Mount Thor, crazy peak. I guess this is in moonlight. It certainly looks like it. And I like the central position of the mountain. I mean, when you have geological forms like this, I mean, why not just put it front and center, give it as much impact as possible, and with all the clouds swirling around it and that hint of a glacier below, I mean, just incredibly dramatic, and also understated. I mean, there's nothing particularly bombastic about the approach here, but it just shows off what an amazing mountain that is. So I like that one. He has taken a little bit of color out of the edit. If I show you the original here, then the sky was a lot bluer in Andrew's original shot, but I think that in that case the desaturation is maybe a good thing. I certainly don't mind it. Okay, on to the third shot. So this is from Skur and Fiddler in Assynt. I've been up here with both on my own and with a group before, and to be honest, I've never been happy with the view from this location. I doubt I will return, and it's for a very specific compositional reason, which is I don't like this massive hulking mountain here. This one's called Ben Anoin, and the mountains in the back to me are far more interesting. So there are other areas in this ridge where you can rearrange this composition and it becomes less of a problem. That said, Andrew shot this in pretty ideal conditions, obviously. I mean, an absolutely sensational sunrise, and to have all this mist swirling over the mountains as well, it couldn't be more perfect. And this mass of mist here really helps to break up what would otherwise be a sort of impenetrable shape visually for the image. I would say that all of the interest is on the right hand side, and this weight of the mountain and the cloud here only accentuate that. I mean, most of the interest is happening to the right of center, but certainly to the right of this peak here, which is called Stack Poly. And so it doesn't quite balance, and yet I think this is the best compromise to make, because if you start to crop in from here, then you cut that pool in half, and actually I think it's quite nice to include that in the image. And it is also good to shoot this way because you see the mountains running out to the sea there, and it is an unusual landscape, and shooting it at its full width like this does give an appreciation of that. So that's all pretty good. I would say that in terms of the edit, it could have been handled slightly better, just with some really particular issues. I mean, I don't know how these colors were achieved, these greens at the top of the image here, greens and yellows, but they look quite funky, as does this area here, rather dark, deep purpley red. So just a simple edit in Lightroom does a better job there. Again, I'm not exactly sure what went on with the edit. Where's my there it is. I created a digital negative, so I just took those 3 exposures you saw there and combined them into an HDR file, and then just crushed the highlights, boost the shadows, add some contrast. I mean, it's the same old stuff really, yeah, you get there pretty quickly. And obviously you want to lose this foreground, as Andrew had decided to do, and lose some of this sky, and exactly where you decide to put that edge is kind of up to you, I guess. But it's not going to take much more than that, to be honest, for it to be perfect. Maybe a little boost of the brightness in the foreground and a bit more contrast. But yeah, absolutely stunning conditions, amazing view, and pretty well executed too. So now we're off to Patagonia, another place that was on my bucket list that has become a lot shorter with my concerns about the amount I'm already flying in going to South Africa just once a year, and Europe a few times. So I may never see this for myself, but I would love to see this mountain Fitzroy. It's like a crown of spires. There can't be many more beautiful mountains in the world, and this is a really nice wide angle shot of it. Compositionally, I think this is really strong. So it does make sense to frame the mountain centrally here because it's such a symmetrical mountain, and I really like the layers that this is broken up into, and even these rocks in the foreground, I actually think they're quite a nice feature, nicely positioned. Initially I thought maybe we want a tiny bit more space in the foreground, between the bottom of the frame and those rocks, but on reflection I'm not sure that it really needs it. But I do have some issues with the edit. Again, if you zoom in on these areas, I mean, it just looks like the sky has been edited to be grey, and you can see this weird transition between the blues and the pinks in the sky. So sorry to be a bit harsh there, Andrew, but these kind of detail issues really matter. There's some photographers, I don't want to name names, who do this kind of colour grading. So they push oranges and yellows into reds, and they push blues into sort of navies and greys, and it creates this graded look. I don't particularly like it, but one thing I really don't like about it is the artifacting it creates and these weird skies. And a lot of these guys do well on social media, but their prints must look absolutely diabolical because you can see the artifacts even on social media. So anyway, that's my rant for the day. But a beautiful image, but I would edit it quite differently myself. Where are we? Here it is. So let's pop that one out. And I've had a quick go here, and actually we have got a bit more space for those rocks, so maybe I will just leave a little bit more room there at the bottom, bring the sky in, and then lift the shadows a bit more, perhaps put a gradient over the foreground. I mean, the one thing I don't understand about the color shifts is, you know, these colors are so beautiful. I don't really know why you would want to change them. I mean, I like to keep my blues on the ultramarine side, so I would introduce a slight color shift there, and perhaps desaturate the blues just a little bit, but not nearly as much as we saw in that edit. And yeah, maybe a gradient as well, just to darken the top there. But something like that, and you could even introduce a bit more saturation into this foreground. Anyway, really beautiful shot. I'd love to see this scene for myself. Anyway, on to, I think, the final image now, which is this from Senja, from a mountain called Hustfjellet, and pretty dramatic lighting. I'm not so sure on the edit. Again, it's a bit warm, it's a bit underexposed. We've got that the highlights being grey again, which I find to be one of the most visually distracting aspects of an edit. If I just paint white crudely over the photo there, you can see just how dark those highlights are compared to where they should be. We've got the man on top of the spire in a pose that is in favour with so many people. I used to do this kind of thing myself, and maybe I've grown a little tired of it now. But it does offer landscapes like this an amazing sense of scale, so I can certainly understand the appeal. Yeah, it gives a bit of context, doesn't it? And compositionally, I think this is really good. In fact, I happen to have shot this exact composition myself. I think in 2017 I was there with a friend, Harshen. But I think that this bush coming out at the bottom here is quite nice, and I like the central positioning of the peak here. Although I when I shot it went like this. So yeah, very, very nice shot that, but I would edit it slightly differently. So I will show you that quickly. So pop this one out, and okay, I haven't made a digital negative here. So again, if you don't know how to do that, you just go photo merge HDR, and the computer wears away. And if you've got a fast computer, it will do it quickly. And if you have a slow one, then you could be waiting for ages. And you can leave the auto align on. I tend to turn the auto settings off actually. Although the auto settings can actually just give you a nice baseline to work with. It tends to boost the shadows and darken the highlights. but we'll do that from scratch. So boost the shadows, darken the highlights, add some contrast, boost the exposure, play around with a grad for the sky to hold back that brightness locally. Perhaps introduce a bit more warmth. And I'm really not happy with this edit, actually. It's not looking good at the moment. But I mean, I think that's kind of the reality of roughly where it would end up for me. I remember when I edited it myself, my own image, I had problems with the highlights on the rock here because I also had some fairly strong sunlight, and it kind of created a texture that was a bit too much. But yeah, I'd go somewhere like this, and I'd perhaps locally edit some aspects of the image to help them and the colors come through. I mean, without the figure on top of the peak there, you could actually bring the frame down, which I think from a compositional standpoint would actually work quite well. But it doesn't work at all with the figure on top, because it looks like he's about to hit his head on top of the edge of the frame, which sounds ridiculous, but it's certainly what I feel. Yeah, maybe I'd do something like that. And we can do whatever we want to bring down the brightness of the sky up there, but the one thing we mustn't do is darken the highlights so that they become grey. So they do need to keep that freshness, and maybe this can take a bit more magenta. Yeah, there we go. So that's starting to look quite nice now. And let's go for the 5,500 Kelvin white balance, and that really is as far as I would take it. And it's quite it's still quite away from the original here, which is deeply saturated, and you can see we've got sort of purples and browns coming into the sky, which are not naturally part of the scene. So I'd just go back if I wanted like that, quite frankly, which I know we don't always have the luxury of doing, but that's just my thoughts on the matter. So thank you very much for sending those in, Andrew. My kind of images, spectacular stuff. I would say that it's probably worthwhile revisiting some of the edits on here. And as I discussed in a previous video, I think your editing is maybe a mishmash of a few different styles, because this image here is really brightly colourful and edited very close to how I would edit myself, whilst some of the others have got these strange combinations of hue shifts and desaturation or color casts that you're introducing. This one's fairly neutral, but we've got that same grey sky thing going on. I mean, some of these edits aren't really to my taste, but it's not for me to put that on other people. I would just say that if you have some consistency with your edits, then it'll help your work to tie together better. But thank you very much for sending those in.